This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the next 60 minutes, we'll run through the business news stories you need to know about from Africa and beyond. But let's start with a quick run through the markets for you. So Kenya's bourse has been trending lower for the last 5 weeks. The NSE 20 has fallen by just over 6% since the start of July. Bank and gold stocks ranked the top 40 of the JSE much lower today, closed nearly 1% in the red. Bullion miners like Gold Fields and Anglo Gold Ashanti were around 1.5% lower. More diversified miners were also in the red. The bank index at the JSE also 1% in the red. Investec, in fact, was the worst performer there, closing over 2% lower. Further afield, the Nasdaq Composite was essentially within 100 points or so of its high of 12,050 points so far this year. It was just over 0.34% higher just after 1600 GMT. Here's what's coming up tonight. The IMF is scaling back projections about the impact that COVID-19 will have on the global economy. Kenya Central Bank removes 337 non-deposit-taking lenders from the Credit Reference Bureau system. And we'll explore why the European Central Bank is preparing to introduce a digital euro. From the world of macroeconomics all the way to crypto, we've got plenty of ground to cover. But let's start with the global picture tonight. The International Monetary Fund has scaled back its estimate of the hit to the global economy from the COVID-19 pandemic this year, but just a tad. The body is still warning that the final bill for this pandemic will total over $28 trillion just in lost output. In its flagship World Economic Outlook report, the IMF said that a stronger than expected performance in the second and the third quarters essentially meant that it believed that global output would decline by 4.4% this year. Now that's a little bit better than the 5.2% decline forecast during the summer. But the IMF said that rising infection rates in some emerging market economies had forced it to pare back its estimate of the rebound in 2021 from 5.4% to 5.2%. It's also warning that the gap between rich and poor countries is expanding relatively rapidly. Now, China at the same time says it has announced measures to alleviate the problems involved in African debt loads. The Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Zhao Lijian, says that China attaches great importance to debt suspension and alleviation in Africa. It is committed, he says, to fully implementing the G20 debt relief initiative. Now, the Export-Import Bank of China, which is essentially an official bilateral creditor, says it has signed debt suspension agreements with at least 11 African countries and other non-official creditors and have also reached consensus on debt relief with some African states. Zhao said that China will exempt 15 African countries from interest-free loans due by the end of the year and continue to promote the international community, especially the G20, to further extend the duration of the proposed debt suspension program. All right, then, so let's dig a little deeper into the details of how this ongoing wrangling over debt relief issues might actually play out among sub-Saharan African economies. Ken Gishinga is the CEO at Mentore Economics. He joins me live tonight. Ken, good to have you on the program. So let's start with the Kenyan context. Kenya is one of the countries that has opted to not take part in the G20 debt suspension program. And we also don't have a massive wall of Eurobond payments that are due, with the next maturity due around 2024. But does Kenya have the fiscal room to ride out this crisis?
Indeed, and thank you, and good evening, Ramah. You're very right to say the fiscal room for Kenya is getting narrower by the day. Kenya had opted out of that initiative because, according to its assessment, its terms were too restrictive, particularly given the fact that a third of Kenya's external debt is owed to private creditors. So there was a thinking that playing into that program might ruin Kenya's sovereign ratings.
Let me just jump in there a little bit, Ken, because we tend to discuss these issues. We tend to discuss these issues, but when audiences listen to us and they wonder, wait, hang on, but it's literally a debt suspension. I'm not asking you to take a haircut. So how is it that if a country asks for essentially a deferral of some of its debt obligations, that therefore has cross implications for other debt? Break that bit down for us.
Well, that's a good question, and it does seem ironical, but each country has a different debt structure. Some countries have more domestic debt, others have more foreign debt, and Kenya is equally split between domestic debt and external debt. Now, when you think of much of Kenya's debt, China, of course, is one of the biggest creditors, and there are a number of private creditors. So, in the assessment, those are feeling that yes, you might get some relief, some stimulus from the G20 debt relief programs, but the cost, according to the assessment, was too big because once your ratings start to go down, their assessment was those private creditors that Kenya has largely depended on in future might not be able to extend lines of credit in future. So it definitely must have been a tough decision, but I think that was the thinking, especially given the structure of the Kenyan debt.
Right. So essentially, the basic idea here is if I've borrowed money from you and another party in future, if I default on that debt or even ask for a deferral, that implies that my ability to pay is problematic. It's in doubt.
That's absolutely a good way of putting it. And as I said, the debt structure of different African countries is quite different. You must remember, Kenya is the third largest recipient of Chinese loans after Angola and Ethiopia. So definitely, Kenya's focus will largely be on the direction China goes. And you remember that China is not part of the Paris Club of creditors. So that and the CBK governor has reiterated that bringing together China and Russia, which are big lenders to Africa, into these Paris Club agreements might make it easier in future for countries like Kenya to be able to opt in into these kind of programs.
Right. Let me just extend that analogy just a little bit. Isn't part of the problem here, because we've seen the World Bank president, David Malpass, argued a little earlier that, look, part of the problem as to why some G20 countries are reluctant to extend this debt suspension is that they believe that it would essentially mean that some creditor nations are not being treated on the same level playing field as others. In other words, if I borrowed money from you and then I turn around and say, look, give me a break for 6 months, but then I keep servicing debt to another person, I'm basically not treating you in the same way. Isn't that the moral hazard problem that's playing out here?
Indeed, it is a moral hazard problem. And actually, if you think of it from a broader perspective, where people have argued that the entire political economy of Africa has been tied to these loans coming from these European, American, and Asian countries. And with that, those countries do have some sort of power. So being able to relinquish that kind of power definitely sometimes is not in their best interest. But I think the bigger narrative here is countries have been hard hit because of COVID. They'll be unlikely be able to raise taxes, and whether you allow them or don't allow them, chances are that they won't be able to finance these budgets, and they'll need the money. You saw Zambia only 2 weeks ago defaulted on its international obligation. So there's already a feeling that whether they agree or not, the fiscal position of these countries is in a very dire position, and it's in the best interest of the global financial order to be able to maintain that stability. And I think that's the reason that they're trying to push these arguments that David Malpass just announced.
Indeed. One last question for you, Ken, because at the end of the day, as you pointed out, tax revenues are likely to fall. Spending requirements, however, are still going up. But you've got these three different parties at play here. You've got commercial creditors on one hand, you've got non-Paris Club lenders like China, and then you've got the Paris Club, the United States, the UK, and of course all the other elements of that particular group. And how do we get all of these parties into one room on an agreement that they can all sign off on? Because it sounds like they're all pushing in completely different directions.
Well, it's very difficult. Those countries rarely would be able to agree on such an important matter. It would be very difficult because even they have different geopolitical interests in Africa. Africa is considered to be an emerging market next to the next, youthful demographic dividends, and they all want a slice of that. So it's quite unfortunate that African countries, and I think the bigger thinking here is, how do we start getting out of this debt? How do we start applying economics that really enable countries to be able to generate their own revenue and really reduce the level of debt that we have. Because yes, countries are free politically, but these debts are a major burden on the public sectors of these African countries. So I think the big thinking is, yes, we might try to crowd in all these creditors into one room and ask them to give debt relief. But I think the bigger conversation has to be, how do we put Africa first? How do we put people working first and being able to be self-sufficient so they don't need loans in future? And sometimes I don't think that second part of the conversation gets enough airtime, if you like.
Indeed, certainly something to consider in the future. Ken Gishinga, thank you very much for your input tonight. Let's move on to Zimbabwe. The country's finance minister, Professor Mthuli Ncube, has said that the economy over there will not be as severely impacted by the pandemic as initially feared. And he says that foreign currency inflows are still resilient. Here's CGTN's Farai Makutuya with those details.
When the first COVID-19 case was recorded, Zimbabwe's doctors and nurses were on strike. Inflation was spiraling and the local currency in free fall. Many feared the worst for the struggling economy. But according to Treasury, which forecast a 4.5% recession for 2020, the crisis may not be as scathing as initially projected. But some here feel it's too early to tell the full impact, especially as some mostly informal businesses are still counting the losses of the lockdown.
And went on a premature shutdown without then the corresponding actions that follow a shutdown. And this lockdown has really further bled an economy that was almost on the sickbed, almost dying. We are not anywhere near quantifying the extent of damage that has caused. And it's going to take us months, if not years to come, to deal with the aftermath.
Zimbabwe's finance minister is enjoying the dividends of reforms that have led to recently retreating inflation and a stable exchange rate. Achievements he believes will improve Zimbabwe's prognosis come the end of year.
So inflation is receding, purely reflecting depressed aggregate demand, because citizens and households have no incomes. And that's not difficult to see. When 18 months ago, a professor who was earning 1.8, 2,000 USD equivalents is now earning about 150. To restore aggregate demand, you need to address issues of real wages. To address issues of real wages, there's a second round effect on inflation. And this is the trap that we find ourselves in.
Economic observers say there is need for confidence restoration measures.
It is the only confidence that is going to sustain the current temporary progress that we are talking about. Someone must believe that this new stability is the new steady state and that we're not going to have surprises.
Zimbabwe is pinning hopes of a continued economic rebound on a better than average farming season and increased mining revenues on the back of enhanced production and firming commodity prices. Farai Makutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
On to North Africa, Egypt's economy is forecast to dodge a recession this year. GDP growth is now expected to be 2% despite the COVID-19 pandemic. That revised forecast follows the large public investments that have been made by the state in a range of construction projects, but also a boom in the telecommunications sector amid the pandemic-related slowdown. Here's CGTN's Yasser Hakim examining the measures that the North African nation has taken to weather the storm.
It's another stamp of approval by an international financial institution. Rating agency Moody's and the International Monetary Fund had earlier commended Egypt's economic performance. And now the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development says Egypt is the only economy across all the regions in which the bank invests that is expected to escape recession in 2020. Experts relate this to the aggressive economic reforms started in 2016 and the quick response by the North African state to tackle the pandemic.
The Central Bank of Egypt did cut interest rates by almost 3% at the beginning of the Corona period, which helped a lot, of course, the businesses and the individuals also to get loans at a discounted rate, which was crucial in order to keep the businesses and the individuals who are suffering from some financial tightness to continue throughout this period. Secondly speaking is the fact that Egypt did not do a full closure like Saudi or UAE or Kuwait. So all in all, yes, Egypt did put some restrictions, but at the end of the day, we saw regular working hours from 9 till 5 p.m. at the beginning of the corona situation, and then it started to be more or less flexible. So also of why we're still witnessing growth.
A stimulus fiscal package of over $14 billion announced earlier in the year has protected several ailing sectors from shutting down. Significant funds, mainly from foreign loans, have been invested in increasing local production of food and agricultural products, thus reducing import costs, saving on expenditure, and keeping local businesses alive. The London-quartered EBRD also affirmed the positive results to the mega infrastructure projects launched by the government before and during the pandemic, as well as the flourishing e-commerce and telecom sectors. Meanwhile, the government saw the expensive import bill of petroleum products drop significantly due to lower consumption because of the pandemic-induced lockdown.
We think overall that the Egyptian economy itself is very different than the rest of the region. The Egyptian economy is locally driven from a local population, unlike, for example, the GCC, which is mainly driven through expats and through foreigners. So that's one thing. The second thing is that the Egyptian economy is not solely driven also on oil prices. It's mainly locally driven through local investment activity and local consumption.
The pandemic still has had a huge impact on the budget. Finance Minister Mohammed Maid says the state has lost a significant $14.1 billion in revenue. It's a result of lower yields from major sources of income such as taxes, the Suez Canal, and tourism. The government expects the critical tourism and aviation industries in particular to suffer the most, even post-COVID-19. The sectors are expected to need more time to rebound. According to a World Bank report, Egypt is the highest recipient of foreign direct investments in the Middle East and North Africa so far in 2020. Another vote of confidence from investors concerning Egypt's economy. Yasser Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
All right, then a quick run through some company headlines. Let's start in logistics. The world's biggest container shipping line company, Maersk, says demand is recovering apparently faster than expected after falling pretty sharply at the height of the coronavirus pandemic a few months ago. The firm lifted its earnings outlook, but it also announced plans to cut some 2,000 jobs as it streamlines operations to cut costs. Maersk handles roughly 1 in 5 containers shipped worldwide. Also in East Africa, a fallout from human rights abuse claims against Kakuzi began to take its toll on the Kenyan agricultural firm's business. Yesterday, this comes after Britain's largest supermarket chain, Tesco, suspended supplies, in this case for avocados. Tesco confirmed in an email response to a local publication, Business Daily, that it had suspended any dealings with Kakuzi pending its own investigations into the allegations. And the World Bank has banned Kenyan IT firm Technobrain Limited and its United Arab Emirates-based parent company Technobrain Global for fraud. According to the facts of the case, both techno firms apparently engaged in an arrangement to obtain and edit confidential bidding documentation in order to influence the awarding of a contract in their favor in Liberia. The Kenyan unit will remain banned from World Bank-supported projects for 28 months. The parent company will be blacklisted for 10 months. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up. Kenya Central Bank removes 337 mobile phone lenders from the Credit Reference Bureau system. And a raging inferno has disrupted tourism activities around Mount Kilimanjaro, Africa's highest mountain. The details coming up next.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business. only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra. Hello, Naro.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome back to the program. Kenya's central bank has delisted over 337 digital and micro lenders, has offered non-deposit taking institutions from the list of lenders that can report defaulters to credit reference bureaus. Now, that move has seen the number of firms that can report defaulters to CRBs reduced to about 2,224 in the month of September. That's from the 2,332 recorded in May last year. The regulators also set up new regulations that cap the lowest amount of money owed to a lender that can warrant reporting to CRBs at roughly $10, or the equivalent of just about 1,000 shillings in this country. Borrowers who had been blacklisted for lower amounts will now be cleared. Over 2 million Kenyans have been negatively listed as loan defaulters in an economy where job cuts, near stagnant wages have left thousands of people trapped in debt. All right, then let's examine trends in the non-deposit lending space with Ivan Mboa. He's the regional general manager covering East Africa at Tala, one of the larger players in that particular space. Ivan, good to see you. So let's start with a broad picture here. 10 months into 2020, how is the business, Tala in particular here, performing on the key metrics, fresh lending, default rates and NPLs?
Well, I think 2020 has been a challenging year all round, actually, for the digital finance business and sector, and Tala has not been an exception. After a challenging Q2, where we saw defaults spike to the highest level, we're actually happy to see that our default rates are returning to pre-COVID levels, at least by the end of Q3, and we actually expect to see this trend continue. I'm not able to speak directly to our specific Tala default numbers, but I can tell you that overall, the non-bank digital finance industry has seen default rates that are largely in line with the banking industry, which has provisioned about 38% of the total loan book ever since the onset of COVID.
Okay, but on an annual basis, we've also seen something rather curious on the banking side, because Kenyan banks turned out to lend 21% more, this is just January to May, compared to the entire second half of 2019. Credit demand clearly was still very much in play. Was it a comparable demand rise seen among your members in the Digital Lending Association?
Absolutely. And I believe that this sort of rise in, let's say, the supply of credit to the private sector has also been supported by the significant increase in the number of new digital lenders in the market. I think, as I heard you mention earlier on, estimates of the number of fintechs range from about 110 conservatively to about 336. And the digital lending space is pretty interesting. It's concentrated with 3 bank fintechs owning about 95% of the space, and about, let's say, up to 336 lenders sharing 5% of the balance. And so as you sort of see this significant increase in players, they are all essentially increasing the amount and supply of credit made available to Kenyans. And so we saw that as well in the same period.
What the central bank, of course, in April, I believe, or is it late March, when they were announcing the part of the plans that they're essentially providing in order to ease the economic burden that would come with this pandemic, one of the things they implemented was suspending the listing of loan defaulters for at least 6 months, between April and September. But how did that change the behavior of both people who had already borrowed money from firms like Tala and prospective new borrowers from Tala?
That's a really good question. So I would say that we have seen changes in behavior, but I'd say that they're largely driven by the spillover effects of COVID, right, on the macroeconomic indicators, general growth levels. Then we have from that guideline that the central bank issued to credit reference bureaus. So I would say that we have not seen default rates rise specifically as a result of that central bank listing, but we definitely did see a correlation with the overall COVID period. That being said, we are aware that for many borrowers, effectively default is driven by two factors. There is sort of involuntary default, as what happened this year to a lot of businesses. So sales are down, or you're an employee, you've lost your job. And there's voluntary default, right? Where there are individuals who will go ahead to borrow with no intention of repaying. And so I think the suspension of listing the loan defaulters is definitely going to egg on and see a rise in the amount of voluntary default in the market.
Just to follow up on that particular question, because one of the things that we tend to hear whenever we look into this particular space is that you'll see individuals who've, speaking to the second category of borrowers that you've mentioned, guys who'll come and borrow from Tala to pay off a loan from Branch, to pay off a loan from Okash or whoever the case might be. Do we have any idea what percentage of clients that kind of borrower forms in the market?
That's actually a tough one, but I'll give you a statistic that can kind of help you get a sense for how big this problem is. And this actually comes from one of our partners, TransUnion, who are one of the largest credit reference bureaus in this market. And what they noted is that between 2018 and 2019, the average Kenyan went from having 4 digital finance apps in their phone to 8 in 2019. And then from 2019 to 2020, that increased to actually 12. So effectively, in the space of less than 2 years, we've seen a 3-fold increase in the amount of Kenyans who have over 12 apps on their phone. And so while it's hard for us to sort of pin a percentage, I think it's really clear that this is a significant issue in the industry. As I'm pretty sure that consumer incomes have not risen 3 times, right, in that same space of time, even though they have increased the number of borrowing apps on their phones by 3x in 2 years.
Indeed. What about the unforeseen consequences? Because we can see why the central bank moved in this direction, because there were abuses of using the CRB system to essentially chase down loan defaulters. But what are the unforeseen consequences? Because one of the ones that comes right at the top of my mind is the fact that you've got all these different companies, say 110 of them, working in this space, but they all have the visibility into the loan default rates essentially chopped to virtually nothing.
That's very true. There are a number of unforeseen consequences, and I'll sort of focus on 2. And I think you've mentioned one that's top of mind. The first is that effectively by locking out digital lenders from the local credit reference bureau system, you're now ensuring that almost all lenders are flying blind or flying in the dark, so to speak. You know, you might have about 45 banks in this market, but potentially 110 to 330 digital lenders. And if they're still operating, you as a lender, even if you're a regulated lender, you don't know the extent to how overborrowed your customer is, right? And this is generally bad for everyone, right? It's bad for the 336. It's bad for those who are still allowed to contribute information to the Credit Reference Bureau. But also, second, an unexpected consequence is that I think in the public focus on how Kenyans have been listed for loans less than $10, a lot of people are actually forgetting about the Kenyans that have built up a positive borrowing history. So for example, we as Tala, we have lent to over 3 million Kenyans in the space of the past 5.5 years, of whom the vast majority have repaid their loans. But if we cannot contribute our data to the Credit Reference Bureau, effectively means that all those years of establishing good borrowing history go to waste, right? It means that effectively, maybe the credit scores of these customers who borrowed from us will not count for anything when they go approach a larger bank lender. So I think that ultimately, it is also going to be a net negative, actually, for the general society.
One last question for you very quickly, because this also sounds like an opportunity. Yes, some of your members have been barred from the CRB system, but you've also essentially come together as an industry grouping, the Digital Lenders Association of Kenya. Are you intending on setting up your own CRB system?
That's a really good question. You know, I think to whatever extent, we definitely do see the actual opportunity for us to do information sharing amongst the 110 to 330 digital lenders. And that is actually an opportunity that we're actively exploring as the Digital Lenders Association of Kenya. So I'd say stay tuned, and we'll certainly come back shortly with a development in that space.
All right, Ivan Boa from Tala, thank you very much for your time this evening. Appreciate it. All right, then let's move on to Ethiopia. The country's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has urged African countries to reopen their economies and look for ways to attract investments to ride out this pandemic-led crisis. To date, Africa's population has been largely spared from the worst effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's certainly seen its economies hit by the biggest external shock for most of them since independence. From Addis Ababa, here's CGTN's Kirum Chala.
The financial conference on Africa was held under the theme Getting Africa Back to Business following the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. The conference is aimed to shore up African economies and attract investments too in a bid to ensure swift recovery.
Africa back to business.
One of the keynote speakers was Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and the recipient of the 2019 Nobel Peace Prize. He said that though the virus affected fewer number of people in Africa than had been predicted, the continent's economy has been harshly hit.
In Africa, due to combination of factors, including smart policies and structural factors such as demography and settlement patterns, the impact of the pandemic on the economy of the continent, however, has been massive.
The conference that was held virtually is aimed to help Africa garner as much investment opportunities as possible. And for that, the Prime Minister said opening up African economies is crucial amid the pandemic.
It has also become clear that COVID-19 is unlikely to disappear anytime soon. This means we need to start opening up our economies with the knowledge that we are going to live with the disease for a while. Yet we should not let our guards down, but remain even more vigilant than before. We need to strengthen our infrastructure for managing and containing the consequences of the pandemic.
Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed spoke of three important areas that he said the continent must focus on to bring Africa back to business. This incorporates a strong leadership, building continental capacity, and investment on Africa's health system.
As we settle,
while sharing his country's experience of fighting the pandemic, the Ethiopian leader said solidarity and cooperation is key.
In Ethiopia, our collaboration with Jack Ma Foundation to distribute medical supplies to every African country soon after the outbreak of the pandemic through our national carrier, Ethiopian Airlines, was motivated by the recognition that the pandemic was a collective challenge that called for a shared responsibility. To survive, we had to work together, not against one another.
Recovery of the vital African tourism sector is another important area that will help economies rebound from the fallout. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed believes a focus on the sector would help the continent recover quickly from the pandemic-induced economic hardships.
Will no doubt make Ethiopia an attractive tourist destination in the years to come. We envision an integrated tourism package, one that presents natural wonders, our rich agricultural practices, and our diverse cultures. My government is happy to have launched new projects in Gorgora, Koisha, and Wenchi sites where Ethiopia's vast natural endowments intersect.
It is through such forums and direct calls to the global business community that Africa is stating that it wants to return to business as swiftly as possible. But fighting the pandemic on a daily basis and formulating proper coping mechanisms still remains a priority. Grumtara CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Hundreds of volunteers, including students and residents, have mobilized in Tanzania to help firefighters in their efforts to contain a blaze on Mount Kilimanjaro, Africa's highest mountain. Now, the cause of the blaze, which broke out over the weekend at this point, is yet unknown. So far, thankfully, no injuries or deaths have been reported and no property has been damaged either. At nearly 20,000 feet, Kilimanjaro is the highest freestanding volcanic mountain in the world. Its ecosystem supports a life of over 2 million residents on its lower slopes in both Tanzania and in Kenya, which depend directly on the mountain's resources, mostly water and rain, for both agriculture and livestock. All right, then let's get you the latest on this still developing story. Day 3 into that particular fire. Daniel Kijo joins us now live from Dar es Salaam with more. Daniel, what's the latest on this fire around the mountain? Are we getting any more reports of casualties that we can attribute to this fire?
Well, Rama, indeed, Africa's tallest mountain parts of Africa's tallest mountain is on fire. And indeed, the fire started on Sunday and has been raging on for about 3 days. We know, like you said, about 500 people are working around the clock to try and stop the blaze. In fact, villagers who live around the mountain, firefighters, officials from Tanapa, Tanzania National Parks, officials from the Ngorongoro Conservation Area. We also know the fraternity from a tour guide and safari company fraternity are also helping. And according to Dr. Alan Kijazi, who's the Tanzania National Parks Commissioner, no casualties have been recorded so far, which is a sign of is something that everybody is happy about. But a lot of vegetation has been destroyed. About 28 square kilometers of vegetation has been destroyed. So as it stands, there are no official reasons to causes of the fire. Officials are still trying to find out what caused the fire to occur, but no deaths so far or injuries.
Indeed, thankfully, at least we can be thankful for that. Has Tanzania asked for any help from across the border from the authorities in Kenya to contain the blaze?
Yeah, as far as it stands, Rama, we do not know of any official request from the Tanzanian government or Tanzania National Park officials asking for any assistance from any neighboring country, including Kenya. They say that perhaps towards tomorrow, this evening, they are looking to sort of contain the fire, and perhaps by tomorrow, the fire will be put out. As it stands, the fire is moving to the southern part of the mountain, and the Tanzania National Parks authorities are expected to sort of finalize the killing of this fire.
Indeed. One last question for you. I was looking up a 2013 study by the FAO before it came on air that said that the frequency of wildfires is rising rapidly within Tanzania, with anywhere between 8.5 to about 13 million hectares of vegetation cover being burned every year. But do local authorities look at this, then look at climate change, and do they anticipate that the frequency of fires like this might increase in future?
Well, Rama, Africa leads the world in the number of fires and areas burnt almost every year. I mean, for example, a statistic from about 20 years ago says about 175 million hectares of forests and savanna, woodlands and grasslands are burnt in Africa south of the equator. So indeed, Africa is facing this problem. But the number is probably higher even now as it stands in 2020. But, you know, because of the agricultural activities that happen around the mountain to clear land, etc., you know, parts of the mountain has recorded a lot of wildflowers. But the biggest culprit is climate change, because this climate change impacts not just Tanzania, but perhaps the whole of Africa and the world. We know that climate change is causing longer and drier, hotter periods. And when, you know, climate change happens, it causes, you know, forests, which are fuel. This is organic matter, which actually burns to become more drier. So any spark or any sort of unmanaged fire can spread out. So research shows that, you know, climate change causes warmer, drier conditions, which increase droughts and creates a longer fire season, which indeed is increasing the risk of a wildfire around the forest. So indeed, if the forest belt that has been affected by human activities around the mountain is not managed, it could indeed cause more wildfires for the mountain. In Dar es Salaam today, there were heavy rains. So a lot of people in the country were hoping that somehow, by some miracle, the rains that were happening in Dar es Salaam today would have been moved to Kilimanjaro to sort of help manage this fire. But as it stands, the authorities are looking at perhaps by tomorrow to finish this fire and hopefully create a way to minimize the effects of fires around the country, around the mountain.
Indeed, we'll see how this plays out. Daniel Kijo in Dar es Salaam. Thank you. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's in the pipeline. The European Central Bank prepares to introduce a crypto euro. We'll have the details. And Airbus unions have approved job reduction agreements. The details coming up shortly.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what do you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back to the program. You're watching Global Business Africa. Let's move on into the world of currencies, or more accurately, a hybrid, if you will, between traditional currencies and crypto. The European Central Bank is to conduct trials and public consultations on bringing in a digital euro. This is part of the Frankfurt-based bank's efforts to stay ahead of fast-moving tech amidst this pandemic. CGTN's Mia Alberti has this report.
Christine Lagarde wants Europe to learn from this pandemic. A bad crisis cannot go to waste. That's what she said on Monday as she presented the European Central Bank plan for the Eurozone after the pandemic. She said that Europe should become an easier place to start a company and job opportunities. She also called on more public investment for green and digital industries, which have increased during the pandemic already. She also called for more education and training of new workers for these two industries. So this digitalization of Europe was quite central to Ms. Lagarde's speech on Monday, a trend that she said should continue in the future of the European Union, and she also hinted that a digital euro could be part of that.
It's not implemented yet. Decision has not been made yet. We are still in the review and consideration stage, but we've just launched a public consultation so that consumers and Europeans can actually express their preference and tell us whether they would be happy to use a digital euro just in the way they use a euro coin or a euro banknote, knowing that it is central bank money that is available and that they can rely upon.
Lagarde said this European cryptocurrency is inevitable, as Europeans are already moving from cash to digital payments because, according to her, they're cheaper, faster and more secure. But Christine Lagarde also put into focus the inequalities revealed by this virus across Europe. She said that women and those on the lower end of the wage scale were the most affected by the pandemic and urged governments to address these issues. Mia Alberti, CGTN in Frankfurt.
Back into aviation, major French unions have signed a deal with Airbus that covers job reductions and furloughs for production workers whose jobs have been affected by the pandemic. The union said on Monday that the agreement takes effect from the 1st of January and it will prevent compulsory redundancies. The unions also approved a deal implementing government-backed furlough schemes for up to 30% of Airbus's employees. The European airplane manufacturer is looking to cut some 15,000 jobs, but it said that 1,500 jobs could be spared if government backing remains for the furloughs. Outbound travel is still recovering from the pandemic, but the crisis doesn't seem to have reduced Chinese consumers' enthusiasm for imported goods. Sales on several cross-border e-commerce sites have jumped significantly compared to a year earlier. Here's CGTN's Chen Tong with the details.
Hong Kong cosmetics retailer Sasa saw its sales jump by more than 300% on cross-border e-commerce site Kaola.com during the National Day holiday. Though the pandemic cut the number of domestic tourists traveling to Hong Kong, domestic consumers love the shopping there.
International travel has not recovered, and neither has cross-border consumption. But that consumption is shifting to e-commerce. We are optimistic about the rising trend in online consumption. And with the virus well controlled domestically, local consumption trends came into their own during the National Day holiday. We are confident in China's economic environment and potential.
Sasa is far from the only retailer that is seeing a robust consumption recovery in the China market. Olive Yang, a cosmetics retailer from South Korea, has even seen sales rise by more than 900% during the 8-day holiday on Kaola. Retailers from Singapore and Europe also recorded triple-digit growth during the same period. And the same trend occurred on Tmall International as well.
We believe the trend will continue. Chinese consumers like to buy expensive products, but now they like good qualities, and in the future, they will pick the products they like.
Cross-border e-commerce is now very mature in the China market. Cross-border e-commerce sales made via Shanghai's free trade zone jumped by nearly 60% year-on-year in the first half. Nationwide, import and export values of e-commerce shipments rose by some 26% during the same period. Experts believe one of the crucial reasons behind the shopping craze has been the country's campaign to promote cross-border experimental zones. In April, China announced the establishment of 46 new such zones, bringing the total to 105 in 13 provinces and cities. The zones makes the trade in imported products much easier.
The customs are easier and taxes are cheaper in the zones. For the e-commerce platforms, logistics and forex settlements are also easier than with traditional import channels. So most of the platforms will import products from the experimental zones as the trading is quicker and cheaper.
All these benefits will only draw in more foreign retailers. Just before the National Day holiday, famous foreign retailers including Beauty Success from France, Boots from the UK and HCP from Germany all opened new stores on China's e-commerce sites, making foreign purchases easier, whether you are abroad or not. Qintong ICS for CGTN, Shanghai.
The coastal city of Shenzhen continues to play a key role in China's reform process. In the first half of 2020, some 2,000 foreign invested enterprises were set up in the city. Leading the charge is Shenzhen's Qinghai Pilot Free Trade Zone. CGTN's Lisa Rui filed this report.
The Qinghai Pilot Free Trade Zone has strengthened its leading role in China's reform and opening up by better integrating with Hong Kong. In the first half of 2020, the Qinghai Cooperation Zone registered a total of 10,000 Hong Kong-funded enterprises with a registered capital of over 1 trillion yuan, or around $140 billion. The actual use of Hong Kong capital was over $20 billion, accounting for about 90% of foreign investment in Qinghai. Officials say the opening up of Qinghai is expected to not only provide more chances to Hong Kong, but also boost the development of Shenzhen, the Greater Bay Area, and even the whole country.
In the future, Shenzhen will still be market-oriented, legalized, and internationalized. The major entities of our economic structure are private economies and foreign investment. This will not change. We will also create a better business environment for these entities.
Located on the eastern bank of the Pearl River estuary, Qinghai has become a world-class terminal operator. The Ma Wan Intelligent Port has been upgraded here to facilitate Qinghai's focus on globalization. By applying 5G and other advanced technologies, the port is believed to outperform other global operators of its kind by providing customized services.
We are the only one develop our own terminal operating system and share to the other ports. It gives the possibility of the competitive and the diversity. All the suppliers of the smart port construction could involve in our platform.
Ma Wan Intelligent Port is the country's first traditional port upgraded to a smart one. Officials believe it can serve as a role model for others wanting to undergo a smart transformation.
Now, without question, face masks are one of this year's most used accessories. So over the last few months, designers like one indigenous group in Mexico have taken to infusing this protective health item with a little fashion flair. CGTN's Alistair Baverstock takes up that story on What's Hot tonight.
The high Sierras of eastern Mexico, where people still maintain pre-Hispanic traditions. Here, people still speak Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, And when it comes to clothing, the traditional embroidery never goes out of fashion.
Pues aquí nosotros hacemos el bordado.
Our embroidery is based on nature, and when I wear it, I can identify with the place I'm from.
These painstakingly hand-embroidered designs take hours and hours to create, and while they are typical of this region of northeast Puebla state, they are highly prized in markets not only across Mexico, but also around the world. In the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, income from international visitors has disappeared. One businessman has found a way to adapt.
Fue por la necesidad de generar ingresos.
We needed to earn money. As we say here in Mexico, we dance to the song that is played.
Pongan, nosotros bailamos.
With face masks now an integral part of a person's everyday wardrobe, Martin began transferring his designs, normally reserved for formal wear. His business has done better than it ever did before the health crisis.
Actualmente hemos elaborado más de 100,000.
So far, we have made more than 100,000 artisanal face masks, which have been sold not only in Mexico, but also been exported to France, Spain, Switzerland, and the US, where we have many distributors. We're having to rethink our production strategy as a result of the pandemic, to think in new ways, because otherwise our business would have failed.
The brand now even offers matching shirt and face mask sets. Gregorio Mendes is a nationally renowned artist from this region. He says his traditional art helps spread local culture around the world.
Es una alegría inmensa porque
it's a great joy, because it makes us feel that we are part of the wider world. We are sharing our own perception of life, how we see the harmony of nature, the ways we can enjoy it, but also inviting the rest of the world to take the same pleasure in it.
Alistair Baverstock, CGTN, Quetzalán, Mexico.
All right, then a quick run through commodities for you. The Japanese trading firm Mitsui made some rather interesting comments to Reuters yesterday. They're pointing out that they'll be selling the remaining stakes in coal-fired power plants, one of which, incidentally, is in Morocco, over the next decade. They aim to essentially finish that divesting, if you will, by 2030. Roughly two-thirds of its earnings come from energy and metal, so that transition, according to the CEO, will be from coal to natural gas. And that includes an LNG project that they have in progress in Mozambique. Here's what's coming up in the last part. Nigerian tech entrepreneurs are still optimistic despite a squeeze in funding due to the pandemic.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
One last story for you as we wrap up the hour. Before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, the tech startup scene in Nigeria wasn't just growing fast, it was arguably the largest and the hottest tech startup scene in Africa. But things have tailed off a little bit as the pandemic dries up investment flow. But some entrepreneurs are positive that this bleak period will not last. CGTN's Deji Banmus has that story on Grassroots.
When Abolore Salami founded his fintech startup back in 2016, he never imagined the day would come when his finance management enterprise will be seriously affected by a health-related pandemic. He's seen his business affected seriously and investments difficult to come by as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic.
A lot of the results we're supposed to have achieved earlier in the year on the back of some of the groundwork we had done last year slowed down significantly for almost 6 months. Of course, meeting with investors used to be a lot physical, you know, especially because we also do a lot of engagement with local investors. Of course, international investors, you also have to travel. So all of that couldn't happen. Our metrics slowed in some areas. So that affected our ability to be able to engage investors, show them the traction we've done this year, and things like that.
With COVID-19 causing disruptions across the world, startups in the country are increasingly finding it difficult to secure investors. The state of the Nigerian economy, too, is even making things more difficult for them.
So because it's a risky business, it's naturally hard. Investors are naturally, shy to release funding. Now it's extremely harder in Nigeria because there's not enough pool of local investors. Foreign investors have certain pickiness about them in terms of how they do their investing, and even when you are the best startup or you're the best company potentially, if you don't exhibit certain things or if you don't have certain networks, you might not be able to get access to those capital.
But some startups are bucking the trend and raising good funding. One good example is 54Gene, a Nigerian genomic startup which raised a $15 million investment to scale its operations on human genetics research.
The health tech startups have seen a lot of attraction from investors because, of course, the health demand for telemedicine and things like that grew significantly during the COVID period.
I don't have data around how many startup has gotten funding, especially in Nigeria or in the African continent. But I'm sure many investors would probably want to go into health sectors because they know that health sector is going to be very demanding, especially the health tech startup are going to be very demanding in the next 2 to 3 years.
Salami is still keeping his operations running without laying off a single staff. He says he's pretty optimistic the funding situation will change soon.
I think it's just a momentary glitch or a momentary slowdown. I think that we're going to see 10x growth in the next 3-4 years of funding to tech startups, just because everybody's going to go tech. Clients that, takes us 3, 4, 5, 6 months to convince in the past, we're convincing them now in 2 weeks, 4 weeks. They are closing and signing out in a shorter time.
It's that optimism that has kept the number of startups still standing to continue to trudge along, hoping the current dark cloud caused by the pandemic would clear pretty soon. Deji Badmouse, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
All right, then let's wrap up the program with a run through the currencies. We started the hour with a look at the wranglings around how to provide debt relief to African countries. So let's wrap up with a look at what the bondholders are essentially saying with their wallet. If the holders of any of Kenya's 5 euro bonds are concerned, they're really not showing it. Between the 25th of September and the 8th of October, yields on notes due any between 2024 and 2048 have fallen by between 25.3 and 75 basis points. The largest decline, in fact, was in the 10-year note due in 2024. That had a yield of just about 5.5%. We'll leave you there for the time being. That's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on the program in the last hour. There are many ways to get your thoughts back to us. All of them are on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.